All right, so welcome back to a new episode of the IMG series. As you guys might have noticed, there's no video showing up on the screen today. That's because we're recording in the style of a podcast. Excuse me, I can't talk today. But yeah, just to protect Alexa's identity and all that good stuff. But yeah, today I have a very exciting guest joining me today. You guys already know her from her Instagram and blog, A Med Student's Journey. Is something I have been following for quite some time. And I'm just so excited she's given me the time today to spend with me to get to chat about a lot of things. So yeah, welcome to today's episode, Alexa.
Hi guys, and thanks so much for having me. It's really an honor to be even invited to talk, so I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm the one that's feeling very honored right now. But yeah, Alexa, so I appreciate you doing this because I know you're in Hungary right now and the time difference is pretty big. And I'm recording this at 12 p.m. on a Sunday. And you mentioned that it's around 8 p.m. in your country right now?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. Well, yeah, thank you so much for being here. So moving on to what we usually start with in all the interviews I've done so far. Alexa, tell us a little bit about your background and where you are now in your studies and career.
Okay, so I'm a med student in my final year. It's a 6-year program, and I'll be graduating in a few months. I'm studying to be an MD in Hungary, and then afterwards I'd like to go to the US and do my residency there. A little bit about me: I was born here in Budapest and I moved to the US when I was 8. I did most of my schooling, including a bachelor's degree, in the US, and then I decided med school was more what I wanted to do. So instead of applying to the US, I decided to come back home for a little bit.
Right. I actually read a little bit about kind of your story because you blog about it more on your, or you write about it more on your blog rather compared to talking about it on Instagram, which I love because I don't really see a lot of people blogging about their medical and USMLE journey, which is so refreshing. So your blog has always been a go-to website for me when I have questions in my head and I'm too shy to ask you. I'll just look up your blog and try and find something that could answer my question. And yeah, tell us before moving on to our usual questions, how did you even, because this is really intriguing to me, how did you even start your blog?
So it all started from Tumblr. I've been a lurker on Tumblr for a really long time, and I used to have different Tumblrs related to language studies, and then when I studied abroad in Germany, I made a separate one for that. And I stumbled across the study blur world, and from then discovered the Instagram study world. And the more I looked at it, the more I thought, hey, I could do this. I think I could actually be really good at this. So I started doing that on Instagram, and I kept getting these questions all the time, and very similar questions. And I wanted a space where I could talk more about them. Instagram has a 2,000 character caption limit, which makes it really hard to delve deep into certain topics. So I decided I wanted a place where I could really make that permanent and lead people to find these answers to their questions. So that's how the blog came to be, and it's actually my little baby. So I love the blog. It's what I put a lot of my energy into because I really want to make it a source that people search things on the internet and it comes up for them. And I've actually had people who found my Instagram through the blog, which is the best feeling in the world because I've done something right. So I really appreciate that you find it useful because that makes me so happy.
Yeah, and honestly, I think it's just so admirable that you're able to write in such an in-depth manner because I haven't found anything on the internet just yet, especially in the world of blogging. And you would think that by now people would have, come up with a blog of their own and writing their own medical journey and USMLE journey and things like that. And to what you had just said, in addition to what you said, it's like Instagram is so limiting. It's hard to kind of sift through posts because everything on the surface is just like photos, and you can't really like look up information like on Instagram. And the blog that you have is just so wonderful. I love it. I have been, looking at it for like more than a year now, and I think it's such a great source, or resource rather. And so I really thank you for taking the time and effort to put such like relevant content, and they're all so informative. So yeah, obviously I'm fangirling right now. So if you already couldn't tell.
You can't see me, but I'm grinning like an idiot because it's so nice to hear, and it really it does inspire me to put more energy now into the blog posts, because in the past, I would say, few months, I've really slowed down, but I have so many ideas.
Please continue to like keep writing more blog posts. I have to just like keep reading what you have to write. It's just, I love it. So you mentioned, I noticed on your Instagram you went to the US sometime last year to do clinicals. And I wanted to kind of ask, like, based on your experience so far, how would you compare training in the US and in Hungary?
So I think that both of them have their strengths. And unfortunately, my experience in the US was very limited because of COVID. I was in a private clinic setting, so I wasn't really in the hospital, which is obviously where I would be able to compare Hungarian hospital clinics to like the US hospitals. So a little bit of my experience was different because I was comparing like a public hospital to a private clinic, which is of course worlds apart even here. But one of the things that I noticed was the emphasis on having the student do things. So this is something that's become kind of an issue in our final year of med school here, which is meant to be the sort of practical year when you're getting your hands dirty and you're getting in there and you're doing things. And the problem is that many doctors don't have the energy to supervise you to do that.
Right.
As a result, we don't really practice being autonomous here in our last year. And I think that that's how somebody learns best, by doing. Like when they say, okay, here's your patient, examine him, work him up, what test would you order, what are the results, how would you treat him? So, like to give you that experience hands on. So even though we did get, like we meet patients all the time and we do a ton of stuff, most of it's observing. We watch the doctor do the workup, or we do it side by side. When I was in the US, the doctors there were very much like, okay, I've showed you how I examine a patient. Now examine the next patient and refer him to me and tell me what you found and what you would do next. And then my heart would be racing and I would freak out because as much as I've examined hundreds of patients, it was never with the intent of, okay, now he's going to trust things that I found and
Right.
I have to report to him, and then he's going to make up his mind based on the things that I report. So it was terrifying. And of course, it was never like a high risk case. So it wasn't like patient care was in danger at any point. It was usually control patients that they knew very, very well. But it gave me that feeling of autonomy.
That's
So I would say
amazing.
that's amazing. Yeah, it was really
Yeah.
good.
So like to piggyback on that, somebody had asked me on my Instagram, did you have any tips for, I know you mentioned that, your experience was kind of limited because of COVID, but do you have any tips for performing well in US electives? And is there anything you wish you had known beforehand?
That's a great question. And I don't know if I'm the best source to answer it because of my limited experience. But I would say that, silly as it sounds, watching the medical student vlogs on YouTube from the US students really showed me that the kind of like the depth of their interaction with the patients and the kind of responsibilities that they have. So it gave me a glimpse of what might be expected of me. So I know like the whole idea of YouTube being like vlogging being an educational source is kind of strange, but it was really insightful. So that was one thing. And then I listened to a few podcasts, especially for OBGYN. There was a phenomenal podcast aimed entirely at medical students, talking about, okay, so you have a hysterectomy. What is expected of the medical student? So on my way to the hospital in the morning, if I knew I would be scrubbing in for a hysterectomy, I listened to the podcast and it was really, really useful.
Wow, I wish I had known of that podcast when I was in medical school. Can you share with us what that podcast is called?
Ooh, wait, yes, I can definitely find it. Let me
Sorry to
see.
put you on the spot here.
There's also a similar one for emergency medicine, but that one I definitely don't know the name of because I haven't listened to it. I just bookmarked it for myself, but when I
Right.
find it, I will send it to you.
Yes, please.
And I think if I dug deep enough, I might find it for other resources as well, because it seems to be something that people do. Like they make podcasts for medical students.
That's amazing.
So this one was called, let's see, Pimped Podcast, and it's Pimped OBGYN.
Okay. Gotcha. I'll make sure to like link that in the description as well so people can kind of use it as a reference because as a med student, and I love that you mentioned that because you're kind of walking into the unknown basically as a med student and you easily get intimidated by the attending and you don't know what to study for the night before, let's say, a procedure or before you actually have an actual interaction with a patient. So just kind of like narrowing the knowledge down to what you really need to know when you're in a specific rotation would be so helpful, I feel. So I love that you brought that up, Alexa. Um, and I also like wanted to, delve more into like other questions that my followers had sent in. And I know that you had already done step one. Do you have any advice for any IMGs in medical school right now who are preparing for the USMLEs in the future? Like, when's the like best time to start preparing for the USMLEs as an IMG?
That's a great question, and one I think that is tailored to each individual medical student and each curriculum. So for us, the limiting factor in our curriculum that changed or that impacted when I could take the exam was the fact that we didn't have pharmacology until fourth year. And I knew myself and I knew that I wanted to have already studied these subjects before I took step one. So I wasn't going to take step one before I learned pharm in med school because I felt like it would be too scary. So for me, I couldn't take step one until fourth year. Now they've changed the curriculum and now pharm is in third year. And so I would recommend to a med student that they could already start preparing for step one after third year. My recommendation would be to try to schedule it in such a way that you would have some dedicated time, because one of the biggest struggles as an IMG is the fact that our schools generally don't give us time to prepare for the exam. So now that I'm studying through step two, I'm juggling working on my thesis, volunteering, and also going to classes and having clinical rotations. So the best would be to find a time period when you have a little bit of dedicated, where you have nothing else to worry about, no classes, no exams, no, I don't know, Zoom lectures, and you can just focus on step one for 4 to 6 weeks. But of course, you would start preparing long before that. My other advice would be not to study too long. I know personally, and I've also heard of some IMGs studying for the exam like more than a year, 2 years, and I think that that's just emotionally, financially, physically draining. And I don't think that it necessarily improves the score. So yeah, that would be really important. What else? Oh, and then my final piece of like big advice would be to always do questions. A lot of IMGs that I've spoken to, they're usually in a longer curriculum, not like the American med schools where it's 2 years preclinical. Most of us have longer preclinical. So I've noticed that people are tempted to do kind of let me review all the subjects and then start the questions. And I think that's a very bad idea, because most of us, the way we studied wasn't geared towards USMLE material. So what happens is that you're doing all of this studying, but it's the wrong kind of studying because you're not studying for the USMLE style questions. So my advice would be from day one, you sit down, you start preparing for USMLE, start doing questions. You don't have to get them right. Like, don't look at the score, don't worry about your percentage, but just start getting into the habit of answering these US type vignettes, how to read them, how to make it faster, how to work through them, and never stop doing questions.
That's such a great, like, all of what you said is such like great advice, because I think as IMGs, especially when you're still in medical school and you already know that you want to pursue the USMLEs, the first question would be like when to start and how to start, and what you just talked about proved to be like really helpful, because a lot of the times, like you said, our like curriculum as IMGs is so different compared to what the Americans are used
Mm-hmm.
to. And familiarizing ourselves with the vignettes and how they actually compose questions here in the US is such a great way to to get ahead of the game, if that makes any sense, because
Mm-hmm.
UWorld, I feel like you said, you doing questions and not having to pay too much attention to the score, because I feel like that can be like a huge deterrent, looking at the score and what you get after each like UWorld block, and you're like, oh, I don't really know much. But the one mistake I've noticed as well, and I'm so guilty of this, is using UWorld as kind of like a gauge to see how quote unquote smart I am, but not so much
Mm-hmm.
as like a learning tool where it's like, oh, this question was tough. And why was it tough? Because XYZ, I didn't know these concepts, and where do I need to kind of brush up on? So I love that you mentioned all of those things, and it's so important. And so I had another question that wanted to ask you when to start using UWorld. So would you say that it's good to start as soon as you can?
I've had friends who did that and they did phenomenally, but I personally felt like the whole world of like vignette style MCQ questions was so new to me that I wanted to get a little practice in beforehand. So before I started UWorld, I bought a subscription to RX, USMLE RX, and I went through a couple hundred questions, like 400 questions, and I just kind of taught myself how to read these questions and what to look for. And I felt like it was a really great segue into UWorld because it was a learning period. And then by the time I got to UWorld, I didn't feel like I was wasting those UWorld questions. So I personally thought it was very helpful to get into the habit of doing questions prior and then do UWorld. But I had friends who just jumped straight into UWorld and they did fine.
I guess it really depends, huh? It's like a very subjective
Yeah.
journey. Like the USMLEs, there's just no like one size fits all kind of approach. But yeah, and
Exactly.
since we're talking about the exams, I know from your blog that you had already taken step one, and somebody had asked how, and I know you have a lengthy post, which I love, on your blog about your experience with step one and the resources that you used, but
Yeah.
kind of like, which you guys should really check out. I love Alexa's posts. But in a nutshell, can you tell us how you studied for this step one exam?
Sure. Um, I'd love to. It would take a
Awesome.
long time to talk very in detail, so I'll try to tell you guys the most, or what I think was the most important. So I did do a little bit of RX and I watched the Express videos to go along with first aid as I read through first aid. And I did U World. So when I switched to U World, I did it in a system based manner. So I didn't do random because I wanted to cover topic by topic. So I would read first aid gastro, let's say, and then I would do that same day, I would do some gastro questions. And I kept doing gastro questions until I finished reading the section in first aid. Then I would start the next section, let's say respiratory. And then I would, on that day or on those days, I would read respiratory chapter and then I would solve gastro plus respiratory questions. And I kept building as I was going through first aid, adding each system as I finished the chapter in New World to the previous ones. And by the time I was done with first aid, I had basically unlocked the entire Q bank and I was doing basically random, randomized questions. So for me, this was great because I felt like I was able to read a section in UWorld, in first aid, and then be tested on it pretty soon. And so I liked that a lot. In the beginning, I did it not timed. So it wasn't like test mode. And then once I felt more comfortable, I switched from tutor mode into the time mode, which I think everyone should absolutely do because you need to learn how to time yourself and how to
Right.
fit. Yeah, so that's definitely very important. But I started off in tutor mode, a little bit cautious, a little bit nervous in the beginning. I did 2 passes of UWorld, which I absolutely recommend mostly to anyone, IMG or AMG, but I know some American med students don't do a second pass, but I personally think that that's almost necessary. And between the first pass and the second pass of UWorld, I also did MBOS questions. Not the whole question bank. I have to admit, pretty unproductive during that time of my life. But I kept doing questions almost every day as much as I could, and then did my second pass of UWorld. I left myself 5 weeks of dedicated, which was when I really saw my scores go up. And I took a practice test every week in those 5 weeks of dedicated leading up to my exam. I left UWorld Self Assessment 2 as my last practice test, and I did the NBME 18 right before that. So those were definitely my last two. And then what else did I want to say? Oh, I didn't do any. Some students do like a baseline NBME before they start
Right.
prepping to see where they are. I didn't find that would be useful because I felt like I knew nothing. So I did an NBME about 66% through my first pass in UWorld. And I remember failing that one. I got like a 192 and I was crushed. And my mom, she told me, don't worry. I mean, you're almost passing and you haven't even
Right.
finished the first pass. You'll be okay. So it really helped to have like that support system. And my parents were absolutely wonderful
Absolutely.
because they could, and I mean, I'm hoping that a lot of you guys also will have somebody supportive in your life who can set your head straight when you start spiraling into doom mode. But the NBMEs in those last 5 weeks of dedicated were so important, so important. So I definitely thought that that was what helped my score grow. And I don't know if you want me to talk about scores. Is that something?
Yes, yes, please. Somebody, I wasn't sure if I was like, if it was okay for me to ask, but yeah, somebody actually asked about scores, but please go ahead and talk about it.
So what happened, or what I noticed in my NBMEs, was that they were trending upwards, which really set my mind at ease because I was thinking to myself, I must be doing something right. And as I took each new NBME, I got a slightly better score and slightly better score. My target score for the exam was a 235 because I set this based on the average of the emergency medicine applicants who had
Right.
in previous years. So I set myself this target of 235, and I thought that that was a reasonable target. And I remember my last two NBMEs were in like the 240s and 250 plus. So when I took my exam, I was taking it with this mindset of like, I've been trending upwards, it's been great. And that was very, very good for morale. On actual test day, it didn't go as smoothly as I would have wanted. And when my test score came back a few weeks later, it was a 230, which pretty much devastated me because I really thought that with my trending upward scores that I would be comfortably at my target score, and I wasn't. So that was a little bit of a hard pill to swallow, and it's still not clear to me what went wrong on test day. But at least I felt like I was doing the right things by preparing the right way because the NBME scores were they were doing well. So in the end, I'm not that happy with my score. Personally, I don't think it's a bad score at all. I had expected slightly more. However, I'm hoping that with my Step 2 CK, I can do better and show the EM programs that I will make a good finisher one day.
I like personally think that's a great score. I think it's
so
just
hard to say this.
I think it's
Because
amazing.
I feel bad. everyone has such a different score, and I know people who failed, and of course my heart goes out to them, and I don't encourage them to give up, and I don't think that like if you get less than a 230 you're stupid, and if you get more then you're a genius.
Right,
So
right,
nothing like that. It's just, for me personally, I had thought it would go slightly better,
right.
so it was a shock. But I don't think that a score should or does define an applicant, so please don't take this as a my score is good or bad, or
Not
I
at
think it's
all.
just
I I just wanted to kind of like butt in and kind of remind you that like wow, I wish I wish I could like eventually get the something like even remotely as good as your score. But it sounds like the bulk of your preparation for step 1, Alexa, was like a lot of questions. Like you had a lot of, you didn't just stick to UWorld, you did RX and then you did AMBOSS. Do you think that the use of all those questions or the studying of those questions during your preparation helped you the most?
I think so. I did this because of what I'd read on Reddit, which was this idea that on test day you're going to be seeing new questions that you've never seen before. So
Right.
redoing a question bank or redoing your incorrect isn't the best approach because you've already seen those questions and you want to train yourself on how to approach new ones. So this made logical sense to me, and I was lucky enough that I was gifted subscription to Amboss. So I thought, why not? Why not
Right.
take some of these questions? And I didn't finish the question bank, um, but I did do extra questions and things that I felt especially weak in, which was physiology. So I thought that was useful. Um, I don't think so. As far as I've read, leading up to my studying it myself, people seem to agree that the number of questions you do correlates most to the score you get out of any other resources. So whether you use Sketchy or Pixarize or Boards and Beyond, none of those are as correlative, I don't know,
Right.
correlational as the number of questions. So that's why I decided to do it. And I do think it helped because it really introduced the same patterns. So if Amboss asked a question where, I don't know, the potassium level was really low, and then it came up again in UWorld and the potassium level was really low, it kind of trained my mind to be like, I should keep an eye on that potassium level because
Right.
it tends to be low. And so that was very much helpful, yeah.
Noticing patterns and then kind of applying that to exam day and yeah, keeping that in mind. I think you're right. Like when you go through questions, you tend to pick up on like what's high yield, what patterns are
Yes,
more
yes.
noticeable. But yeah, that makes so much sense. Now that
I
you're
just want
like,
to, yeah,
yeah,
I
go
just
ahead.
want to say that think, I don't think this is going to sound really, really stupid of me, but I don't think the USMLE is a very hard test in that it's like undoable and ultra challenging. The
Right.
preparation for it, I think, takes a lot out of you and requires so much effort and discipline and
Yes.
hard work. So it is a hard test. But I don't think that the test makers are out to trick you or out to get you. And
Right.
they really focus on very important, clear cut topics, and they test these over and over again. And of course there are curveballs, but learning to notice these patterns, I think are very helpful.
I love that you brought that up, and it's not stupid at all. That question that you asked, or that statement that you just made, but I think it really, like you said, and I couldn't have said it better myself, but the preparation itself is what makes it so difficult, and especially as an
Mm-hmm.
IMG, you're kind of adjusting to a completely different curriculum, and that's what makes it difficult, I think.
Yes, yes.
Um, but in itself, it shouldn't like kind of make you feel like I'm never going to be like a great physician if I don't like pass this exam, and XYZ, all those negative self-talk
Mm-hmm.
that we do, and I'm very guilty of that. But since you mentioned, Alexa, that getting the score, what the score that you got in step 1 wasn't what you had in mind, and that you kind of want to make up for it, quote unquote, come step 2 CK. But other than that, what are some of the things in your CV that you're doing right now or you plan to do to kind of boost your application for emergency medicine?
emergency medicine is a unique residency to apply to because we have something called a SLO or a SLOE, which stands for Standardized Letter of Evaluation. Yeah, evaluation. It's basically a letter of recommendation that's in a very specific format, and only residency program rotations can provide these letters, these SLOs or SLOEs. Um, so the problem or the good thing is that since it's standardized, it's not really based on somebody's like subjective view of you. It
Right.
has very specific questions, and the algorithm also kind of compares you to previous students that they've evaluated. So it's a very good way of kind of ranking applicants. Now, the trouble comes with securing these SLOEs because it's very difficult as an IMG to do a rotation in the US.
Right.
And then on top of that, it has to be at a residency program in the middle of pandemic. So
Yes.
that is my goal for the next few months is to go to the US and do a clerkship in emergency medicine and hopefully be granted a SLOE, which honestly, without this, there's not much hope of applying because most programs require at least one in order to look at your application. So doing that is definitely my goal. I graduate, I think, in the end of June, so it would have to be before that because you have to be a med student to do so. So that's one thing. I'd like to do research. Um, I think I saw somebody had asked this question, so I'm just going to touch upon it. If anything is lacking from, or what I would have done differently in med school for
Yeah,
residency.
sure, please.
So for emergency medicine specifically, research is not so important. It's not one of the things they look at.
Hmm.
However, I'm personally interested in research, and I wish I had been more of a go-getter and kind of sought out the opportunity to do more research. And even if I didn't publish, which I wouldn't have, because that's another thing that's culturally a little bit different here in Hungary, is that they don't really have medical students on publications.
Right.
So even if I wouldn't have published, just the experience and the sharing the passion about a certain subject, I think would have really helped with my application. So in the next few months, or even in the next year, I'd really like to do some research. And what else is in my application? Honestly, I don't feel like I have a very strong one, but we're going to change that because I have a gap year. Yeah. Let's see what else. I volunteer. I've always volunteered. I love volunteering. So I think that since college, I've actually since high school, I've been volunteering. So it's like a hopefully nice trend for my interviewers to see that I've been consistently interested in helping the community. Hopefully that
Absolutely.
will help. Yeah. What else? Oh, and then the pandemic started, and I started volunteering at the emergency department, which not only did that crystallize my desire to go into the field, but that also hopefully will show them that this is really what interests me more than anything else.
Yeah, and I think here in America, especially when you're talking about applications for residency, they really value the volunteer work that you do. Um, and of course, scores are one factor, but I always get the same like feedback from current residents, IMGs and AMGs, and they always say that programs look at the candidates or the applicants as a whole. So, scores are one thing, but what else can you kind of like provide or what else can you offer to the program? They want to see that you're well rounded, you have extracurricular activities, and like you said, getting involved in research is going to be huge
I hope so.
because yeah, absolutely. Everybody I've spoken to has already said that, especially as an IMG, it's not very common to even get research opportunities as an IMG. And whether or not it's a huge factor in emergency medicine, it'll still be a huge plus because they're looking at how interested you are in the field or the specialty, and just getting involved in as many activities related to your field is always going to be a good sign, especially during a pandemic. Like, it's such a hard time for all IMGs to kind of get all these opportunities, so you grab what you can at the moment. And Alexa, you mentioned your gap year. Is that like happening right after medical school, or is that something that's already happened?
It'll be happening right after medical school. In
Okay.
order to have started my residency now in July, I should have applied in this cycle. And I knew that there was no way that I could get a SLOE. Like it was just the onset of the pandemic. I had no leads.
Right.
And without the standardized letter of evaluation, I didn't feel like it was worth the going through the cycle and then having to reapply as a reapplicant. So I
Right.
decided to delay a year, which means that I graduate in June and then I'll be applying this September. And then I hopefully won't start to work until July 2022. Wait, July, yeah, July 2022. So
And
that
I
means that
no,
between,
sorry, go
sorry,
ahead.
after graduation, I'll have a little bit of about a year or like 10 months of downtime.
And it's funny because like our concept of gap year is always like it kind of like feels like it's a bad like move on our part, but you're not exactly going to be like not doing anything during your gap year. You said you would want to get involved in research, you would want to do um, rotations here in the US. So I feel like you, I know you mentioned that your gap, you mentioned that like your application is gonna not gonna be as strong because you have a gap year, but you're filling up that gap year with so many things to do that will actually um, solidify like your application, your CV. And I think it's great that you have all these plans that are eventually going to be put into action, because I think research and rotations, they're all like key elements to like a great CV. Plus, you're doing volunteer work during the pandemic, which is amazing, Alexa. That's just amazing. It's admirable. So I had a follower that asked a question about electives and LORs. And you briefly talked about that earlier about how you plan on doing rotations. Can you share, if you're comfortable, can you share a little bit about how you're going to be getting US clinical experiences and LORs and the like?
So I was one of the few lucky people in my school who could actually do a rotation in the US this year. My school has a relationship, like an affiliation with the private clinic where I went. And none of the other school students accepted to the program could go because they weren't US citizens and the US had closed the border. So this was a very like unfortunate situation for most of my classmates, but I was able to go. And from one of those rotations, I'll be asking for a letter of recommendation. It was pretty awkward, and I think everyone feels the same way. Just it feels so naggy to go up to a doctor who has a million things to do and to ask them to write a letter of recommendation. But I did, and he was super nice, and he said that yeah, absolutely, he'll do it. So luckily, I have that one letter of recommendation from neurology, and now I would like to get one from emergency medicine, and I will also get one from the emergency department here. So for letters of recommendation, they generally recommend to have three, and it's obviously better if it's from a US doctor.
Right.
So, in terms of how to secure a clinical rotation, any advice I have might not be relevant because of the pandemic, but first of all, I would talk to your school, see if they have any sort of connection, anything. Secondly, I would check to see if there are doctors from my school in any of the major hospitals. Just like go on the staff page and type in, I don't know, Mayo Clinic, Semmelweis University, and just see if there is a doctor there and try a cold email. Just say, hi. Well, no, I wouldn't say hi. I would say, dear doctor, dear doctor, I'm a medical student in my final year. I'm really passionate about XYZ, and I would love the opportunity to spend hundreds of dollars flying across the ocean to spend a few hours with
Yes.
you and see if that works. Then I would also go on social media, which is crazy, but the world of med Twitter is very, very active. And I would start
Absolutely.
following the people in my intended field. So if you want to go into OBGYN, I would go and search the OBGYN relevant hashtags and just find those doctors, interact, see what they're talking about. And maybe if you're brave, you can reach out to one. I've also seen some doctors who've actually offered to help, who have offered to say, hey, I can accept 2 students, anyone interested. And then people would be like, me.
Right.
So just get searching. And then the other thing that I only did, and this is one of my regrets, that I only did this year because I didn't know about it earlier, was the National Organization for Emergency Medicine. So EM has two, or actually maybe more, but two major national orgs. One is EMRA, which is Emergency Medicine Residents Association, and then there's another one like SAEM, and it has a yearly membership. It's $60 for EMRA, but it I think can open a lot of doors and opportunities. And depending on the organization you join, you can attend their virtual conferences. You can get matched with a mentor. You have access to all their resources online for medical students and matching. And some of them even have clubs. Like for EM, they have an international emergency medicine branch or like club or subsection, and you can get involved with that, and you can even email those doctors and see if anyone would be willing. And then the final thing would be one of the companies. I personally haven't tried it, but this is definitely on my list of last resort. There's a lot of companies that charge a lot of money to hopefully get you a rotation in the US even now during the pandemic. And it's hard for emergency medicine because they're a lot more limited. But for a
Right.
lot of the other ones, there's a lot of options like internal medicine. There's a lot of places where you can pay and they will give you a rotation and a UC.
And that's like all like really useful information. I think it's just so difficult with COVID, Alexa. And I like that you're bringing up all these important factors to consider. And I didn't even think about the whole, you mentioned about how emergency medicine has these like organizations and the residencies, kind of like community, and connecting or becoming a member of those websites and communities will for now be like a great way to network with mentors and like connect with people. And like you said, med Twitter and even on Instagram, I feel like it's so easy now to connect with other physicians because we're all so like either like glued to our phones or we're stuck at home or like our only form of communication is through social media and all of these like other platforms. But yeah, I think, would you say that I think it also like applies to other specialties as well? It could be like,
Absolutely.
yeah, for like surgery and internal medicine and OBGYN. I'm like 100% sure there's like communities online where people can sign up, be members, and just connect with other physicians and gain mentorship. So yeah, that's such a great tip. I did not like, I hope like followers and listeners will like catch up on, trying to find mentors because it's so hard, especially as an IMG. And you're
It is
mentioning,
hard.
yeah, it's extremely difficult. And I know you had just given us the most like informative and relevant and helpful information as per usual, Alexa. But my last question for you today would be like, what advice would you share for other IMGs or medical students who kind of want to go down that same route as you right now, or just like general advice for IMGs?
I think it's helpful to have an idea of what specialty you're interested in early on, because then you can kind of show that you've been working towards the specialty for a long time. So, since I knew I wanted to go into emergency medicine, I kind of started dabbling in different extracurriculars related to emergency medicine, which shows that that's my passion. So I think that's very helpful. If you think that you might want to do OBGYN, then you should spend some of your afternoons shadowing a doctor or working with a doctor and go on call with them outside of classes, outside of credits, just to get the experience, to get the connections. Even it doesn't have to be in the US, it can be in your home country. But it shows uh, interviewers and it shows people reading your application that it's not like you're just applying to internal medicine because it's quote the easiest thing. You're actually interested and passionate about it. So one is to kind of get started early. Definitely start your exam preparations early as you can. If you don't want to take a gap year like I didn't, then I recommend making sure that you follow a timeline. And there's a timeline, like a really great timeline that I've linked in one of my blog posts, but I will tell you the name in a second. It's the timeline by Match a Resident, and they show you exactly how the application works, and you can work backwards from there and figure out when you should have your test scores by, your letters of recommendation by, in order to be able to apply on time. If you do have to take a gap year, then that's totally fine. I talked to a fellowship director who said that as long as you can show that you've used it productively, they're not going to look unfavorably upon you. But if you do take a gap year, to make it useful, stay relevant, stay clinical, attend conferences, do research, do an observership, get a job. So that's really important. And try not to compare yourself to other people. It's really hard, especially like stay away from the YouTube how to get a 260 plus videos. I mean, you can watch them, but just know that the people who are average or below average, they're not making these videos because I don't know, that's the nature of the world we live in. But the only people who make these videos are usually the people who are on the very high end of the spectrum. And not every person's going to get a 260 plus, and that's totally okay. So don't approach this being like, I have to be the absolute best, because you don't. You just have to be willing, you have to be passionate, you have to be disciplined, and I don't know, all around a good person, I think.
So beautifully said, Alexa. And can I just add to what you said about those YouTubers who make videos about how to get a 260 or how to get a 250? It just drives me crazy because just like you, I think to myself, wait, you're not exactly like on the same like level as me, because I'm an average student, and it's not like you're thinking about like you're right in saying that these are like above average students, and it's not like it's going to apply to everybody who's watching that video. And people who watch that video think that this is their only way to get a 250 is if they follow whatever this person who put out the video had done to get that 250 or 260. And it just drives me crazy because it's sending out the wrong message. And I really appreciate that you're one of the few people who are very open and honest about scores and just not comparing yourself to other people, especially whatever's being put out on social media right now, which can just really take a blow on your like self-esteem and your morale. Thank you so much, Alexa, for doing this episode with me. It was such a pleasure speaking with you, and I will make sure to leave the links to your Instagram and your blog in the description, because you guys have to just like look through Alexa's blog, especially, which I'm so in love with. Plus, she not only makes really in-depth posts, but she also creates like desktop wallpapers every single month. Like how I'm just so amazed. I'm clearly fangirling again, but whatever, don't mind me.
Says you who makes a podcast. I don't know how you do it all, but thank you so much.
Thank you again so much, Alexa. And that about wraps up today's episode on the IMG series. And if you enjoyed this podcast version today, as well as the other episodes and whatever content I upload in here, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And I will see you next time.